Mary Pope Osborne, Magic Tree House 3, Mummies in the Morning. Chapter 6, The Writing on the Wall. Jack and Annie squinted at the pyramid wall. A series of tiny pictures was carved into the stone. "There are 4 pictures here," Jack told the Ghost Queen. "Describe them to me, Jack, one at a time, please," she said. Jack studied the first picture. "Okay," he said. "The first one is like this." He made a zigzag in the air with his finger. "Like stairs?" asked the Ghost Queen. "Yes, stairs," said Jack. "Just like stairs." She nodded. That was easy enough, Jack thought. He studied the second picture. "The second one has a long box on the bottom," he said. He drew it in the air. The Ghost Queen looked puzzled. "With 3 things on top." "Like this," said Annie. She drew squiggly lines in the air. The Ghost Queen still seemed puzzled. "Like a hat," said Jack. "Hat?" said the Ghost Queen. "No, more like a boat," said Annie. "Boat?" said the Ghost Queen. She sounded excited. "Boat?" Jack took another look at the wall. "Yes, it could be a boat," he said. The Ghost Queen looked very happy. She smiled. "Yes, of course," she said. Jack and Annie studied the next picture. "The third one is like a thing that holds flowers," said Annie. "Or a thing that holds water," said Jack. "Like a jug?" asked the Ghost Queen. "Exactly," said Jack. "Yes, a jug," said Annie. Jack and Annie studied the last picture. "And the last one looks like a pole that droops," said Annie. "Like a curved stick," said Jack. "But one side is shorter than the other." The Ghost Queen looked puzzled again. "Wait," said Jack. "I'll draw it in my notebook. Big, so you can see it." Jack put down the scepter and got out his pencil. He drew the hieroglyph. "A folded cloth," said the Ghost Queen. "Really?" said Jack. "Yes, that is the hieroglyph for a folded cloth," said the Ghost Queen. "Oh, okay," said Jack. He looked at the 4th hieroglyph again. He still couldn't see the folded cloth. Maybe it was like a towel hanging over a bathroom rod. "So that's all of them," said Annie. She pointed at each picture. "Stairs, boat, jug, folded cloth." Jack wrote the words in his notebook. "So what does the message mean?" He asked the Ghost Queen. "Come," she said. She held out her hand. "Come to my burial chambers." And she floated away. Chapter 7, The Scroll. Jack put the scepter and his notebook and pencil into his pack. The Ghost Queen seemed so kind and gentle. He wasn't afraid of her at all anymore. Jack and Annie followed her deeper into the pyramid. Finally, they came to some stairs. "The stairs!" said Jack and Annie together. The Ghost Queen floated up the stairs. Jack and Annie followed. The Ghost Queen floated right through a wooden door. Jack and Annie pushed on the door. It opened slowly. They stepped into a cold, drafty room. The Ghost Queen was nowhere in sight. Dim torchlight lit the huge room. It had a very high ceiling. On one side was a pile of tables, chairs, and musical instruments. On the other side of the room was a small wooden boat. "The boat," said Jack. "What's it doing inside Queen Hutepi's pyramid?" asked Annie. "Maybe it's supposed to carry her to the next life," said Jack. Jack and Annie went over to the boat. They looked inside it. The boat was filled with many things: gold plates, painted cups, jeweled goblets, woven baskets, jewelry with blue stones, and small wooden statues. "Look," said Jack. He reached into the boat and lifted out a clay jug. "The jug," said Annie. Jack looked inside the jug. "Something's in here," he said. "What is it?" asked Annie. Jack felt inside the jug. It feels like a big napkin, he said. The folded cloth, said Annie. Jack reached into the jug and pulled out the folded cloth. It was wrapped around an ancient-looking scroll. Jack slowly unrolled the scroll. It was covered with wonderful hieroglyphs. The Book of the Dead, whispered Annie. We found it. Oh, man. Jack traced his finger over the scroll. It felt like very old paper. Queen Hutepi, called Annie. We have it. We found your Book of the Dead. Silence. Queen Hutepi! A door on the other side of the chamber creaked open. Maybe she's in there, said Annie. Jack's heart was pounding. Cold air was coming through the open doorway. Come on, said Annie. Wait, no, said Annie. She's waited thousands of years for her book. Don't make her wait anymore. Jack put the ancient scroll into his backpack. Then he and Annie slowly started to cross the drafty room. They came to the open door. Annie went through first. Hurry, Jack, she said. Jack stepped into the other room. It was nearly bare, except for a long gold box. The box was open. Its cover was on the floor. Queen Hutepi? Called Annie. Silence. We found it, said Annie. Your Book of the Dead. There was still no sign of the Ghost Queen. The gold box glowed. Jack could barely breathe. Let's leave the scroll on the floor and go, he said. No, I think we should leave it in there, said Annie. She pointed to the gold box. No, said Jack. Don't be afraid, said Annie. Come on. Annie took Jack by the arm. They walked together across the room to the glowing gold box. They stopped in front of the box and peered inside. Chapter 8. The Mummy. A real mummy, Jack thought. Bandages were still wrapped around the mummy's skull, but most of the bandages had fallen away from the face. It was Hutepi, Queen of the Nile. Hutepi's mummy wasn't beautiful. It had broken teeth, little wrinkled ears, and a squashed nose. Its flesh had withered. Its eyes were hollow sockets. The rotting bandages on the mummy's body were coming off. Jack could see bones. Oh, gross, cried Annie. Let's go. No, said Jack. It's interesting. Forget it, said Annie. She started out of the room. Wait, Annie. Come on, Jack. Hurry, cried Annie. She was standing by the door. Jack pulled out the Egypt book and flipped to a picture of a mummy. He read aloud. Ancient Egyptians tried to protect the body so it would last forever. First, it was dried out with salt. Ugh, stop, said Annie. Listen, said Jack. He kept reading. Next, it was covered with oil. Then it was wrapped tightly in bandages. The brain was removed by, yuck, stop, cried Annie. Goodbye. She dashed out of the room. Annie, called Jack. We have to give her the Book of the Dead. But Annie was gone. Jack reached into his pack. He pulled out the scroll and the scepter. He put them next to the mummy's skull. Was it just his imagination, or did a deep sigh seem to shudder throughout the room? Did the mummy's face grow calmer? Jack held his breath as he backed out of the mummy room. He hurried through the boat room and headed down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, Jack heaved his own sigh, a sigh of relief. He looked down the hallway. It was empty. Hey, Annie, where are you? He said. No answer. Where in the world was Annie? Jack started down the hallway. Annie! He called. Had she run out of the pyramid? Was she already outside? Annie! Help, Jack! Came a cry. The voice sounded far away. It was Annie. Where was she? Help, Jack. Annie! Jack started to run along the shadowy hallway. Help, Jack. Her cry seemed fainter. Jack stopped. He was running away from her voice. Annie! He called. He went back toward the burial chambers. Jack! Her voice was louder. Jack! Jack climbed the stairs. He went back into the boat room. He looked around at the furniture, the musical instruments, and the boat. Then he saw it. There was another door. It was right next to the door he had just come through. The other door was open. Jack dashed through it. He found himself at the top of some stairs. They were just like the stairs outside the other door. He went down the stairs and into a hallway. It was lit by torches on the wall. It was just like the other hallway. Annie! He called. Jack! Annie! Jack! Annie was running through the hallway toward him. She crashed into him. I was lost, she cried. I think this is one of those false passages built to fool the tomb robbers, said Jack. A false passage? Said Annie, panting. Yeah, it looks just like the other hallway, said Jack. We have to go back into the boat room and out the right door. Just then, they heard a creaking noise. Jack and Annie turned around. They looked up the stairs. They watched in horror as the door slowly creaked shut. A deep sound rumbled in the distance, and all the torches went out. Chapter 9. Follow the Leader. It was pitch dark. What happened? Asked Annie. I don't know, something weird, said Jack. We have to get out of here fast. Push against the door. Good idea, said Annie in a small voice. They felt their way through the darkness to the top of the stairs. Don't worry, everything's going to be okay, said Jack. He was trying to stay calm. Of course, said Annie. They leaned against the wooden door and pushed. It wouldn't budge. They pushed harder. It was no use. Jack took a deep breath. It was getting harder to breathe and harder to stay calm. What can we do? Asked Annie. Just rest a minute, said Jack, panting. His heart was pounding as he tried to see through the darkness. Maybe we should start down the hall, Annie said. Maybe we'll eventually come to an exit. Jack wasn't sure about that, but they had no choice. Okay, come on, he said. Feel the wall. Jack felt the stone wall as he climbed slowly down the stairs. Annie followed. Jack started down the dark hallway. It was impossible to see anything, but he kept going, taking one step at a time, moving his hands along the wall. Jack went around a corner. He went around another corner. He came to some stairs. He climbed up. Annie followed. There was a door. Jack pushed against it. Annie pushed too. This door wouldn't budge either. Or was it the same door? Jack and Annie stopped pushing. It was no use. They were trapped. Annie took Jack's hand in the dark. She squeezed it. They stood together at the top of the stairs, listening to the silence. Meow. Oh man, Jack whispered. He's back, said Annie. Meow. Follow him, cried Jack. He's going away from us. Jack and Annie started down the dark hallway, following the cat's meow. Hands against the wall, they stumbled through the darkness. Meow. Jack and Annie kept following the sound, all the way through the winding hallway. They went around one corner, then another, and another. Finally, they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. They rushed forward out into the bright sunlight. Yay! Annie shouted. But Jack was thinking. Annie, he said, how did we get out of the false passage? The cat, said Annie. But how could the cat do it? Asked Jack. Magic, said Annie. Jack frowned. But look, said Annie. She pointed. The cat was bounding away over the sand. Thank you, called Annie. Thanks, Jack shouted at the cat. The cat's black tail waved. Then the cat disappeared in the shimmering waves of heat. Jack looked toward the palm trees. The magic tree house sat like a bird's nest at the top of one. Time to go home, Jack said. Jack and Annie set off for the palm trees. It was a long, hot walk. At last, Annie grabbed the rope ladder. Jack followed. Once they were inside the treehouse, Jack reached for the book about Pennsylvania. Suddenly, he heard a rumbling sound. It was the same sound he had heard in the pyramid. "Look," Annie said, pointing out the window. Jack looked. A boat was beside the pyramid. It was gliding over the sand like a boat sailing over the sea. Then the boat faded away into the distance. Was it just a mirage? Or was the Ghost Queen finally on her way to the next life? "Home, Jack," whispered Annie. Jack opened the Pennsylvania book. He pointed to the picture of Frog Creek. "I wish we could go home," he said. The wind began to blow. The treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still, absolutely still. Chapter 10. Another clue. Late morning sunlight shone through the treehouse window. Shadows danced on the walls and ceiling. Jack took a deep breath. The treehouse was back in the Frog Creek woods. "I wonder what Mom's making for lunch," said Annie. She was looking out the window. Jack smiled. Lunch. Mom. Home. It all sounded so real, so calm and safe. "I hope it's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches," he said. "Boy, this place is a mess," said Annie. "We'd better make it neater in case M comes back." Jack had almost forgotten about M. Will we ever meet M? Jack wondered. The person who seems to own all the books in the treehouse? "Let's put the Egypt book on the bottom of the pile," said Annie. "Good idea," said Jack. He needed a rest before he visited any more ancient tombs. "Let's put the dinosaur book on top of the Egypt book," said Annie. "Yeah." "Good," said Jack. He needed a long rest before he visited another Tyrannosaurus Rex. "The castle book can go on the very top of the pile," said Annie. Jack nodded and smiled. He liked thinking about the knight on the cover of the castle book. He felt as if the knight was his friend. "Jack," said Annie. "Look." She was pointing at the wooden floor. "What is it?" he asked. "You have to see for yourself." Jack walked to Annie and looked at the floor. He didn't see anything. "Turn your head a little," said Annie. "You have to catch the light just right." Jack tipped his head to one side. Something was shining on the floor. He tipped his head a bit more. It came into focus. It was the letter M. It shimmered in the sunlight. This absolutely proved the treehouse belonged to M. There was no doubt about it. Jack touched the M with his finger. His skin tingled, the leaves trembled, the wind picked up. "Let's go home now," Jack said. Jack grabbed his backpack. Then he and Annie climbed down the ladder. As they stood on the ground below the treehouse, Jack heard a sound in the bushes. "Who's there?" he called. The woods grew still. "I'm going to bring the medallion back soon," Jack said loudly. "And the bookmark too, both of them. Tomorrow." "Who are you talking to?" asked Annie. "I feel like M is nearby," Jack whispered. Annie's eyes grew wide. "Should we look for M?" But just then their mother's voice came from the distance. "Jack! Annie!" Jack and Annie looked around at the trees. Then they looked at each other. "Tomorrow," they said together. They took off, running out of the woods. They ran down their street. They ran across their yard. They ran into their house. They ran into their kitchen. They ran right into their mom. She was making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.